So the agri-food sector in the UK is worth about £150 billion a year, and it employs more than 4 million people. It's also one of the few sectors that's shown real steady jobs growth, adding about 5% to employment in that sector over 2023. So we're very lucky to have two guests with us today who can help explain where those jobs are coming from and what we can do to ensure that they are genuinely green. Ellie Besley-Gould is a director at Xynteo, which helps some of the world's biggest businesses create planet-positive growth. And Alejandro Guarin is Food Systems Transformation Lead at World Benchmarking Alliance, where he helps firms build fairer and more sustainable food systems. So, as a little bit of a scene setter to get us started, perhaps, and this would be an open question to both of you, perhaps you could explain what sustainable practices are having the biggest impact on UK food systems at the moment. Who'd like to lead off?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Am I here? Thank you, and thank you for the invitation too. We actually spent some time before coming in talking about this very question because it's a tricky question and maybe it can be answered in two ways. So one is maybe just to generally, like, what do we mean by sustainable food systems or by sustainability in the food systems? I think it's worth just spending a little bit of time there, because then the answer about what's progress towards that, I think it's important. So just to say, and maybe you know, maybe this is common knowledge here, but the idea is food systems currently have environmental impacts that are destructive at the production stage. So things like deforestation, things like greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss. So all these things are associated with food production. Also at the consumption stage, there's waste, there's plastics, there's all sorts of things around the current food system that are unsustainable. There's also social unsustainabilities or social problems related to exploitation, low income, low wages for people from production to consumption, retail, processing. So there's malnutrition. There's lack of proper nutritious food. I guess malnutrition often refers to it, but just lack of food, but just also lack of good food. So anyway, there's all sorts of problems associated with the food system. So when we talk about what makes progress or what does progress look like, it means how do we address all those things? And it's a very long list. And that's part of the problem, that when we see progress on one side, so we might see, oh, there's more production of really healthy food, but then that might have a really bad environmental consequence. It might be very carbon intensive. It might be producing a lot of CO2 emissions, or it might be converting natural woodland into arable land. So this is just to say, sorry, it's a very kind of convoluted preamble to what I'm about to say, but which is progress actually is really tricky because it's progress across all those things that I just talked about, and it's kind of like cheating if you like produce really great, I don't know, like I always like to give the example of avocados, which is like they're so delicious, so nutritious, but like, and so that's like everybody eating more avocados would be great, but like if those avocados come at the expense of like the rainforest in Peru, then it's kind of cheating, right? It's not good. So we were discussing what does progress look like here, and I'm going to answer that in kind of two ways. One is, I think there is evidence of actually companies trying to do things differently and incorporating some of this kind of vision around what sustainability looks like across all these dimensions that I just mentioned. And so you see sort of from the bigger companies like Sainsbury or Tesco, they have big sustainability departments, and I think we have that sort of thinking more and more embedded in these companies. And obviously you have smaller companies doing great work. You have all these B Corps who are really trying to do, like, changing the business model and doing things sustainably, socially just from the beginning, from agriculture right through to the retail. So we have some evidence of that. It is working. Now, I don't think it's working at the scale or at the depth that is needed, because precisely because the like constellation of problems and challenges is so big. So at the like progress on the specifics, I think we see glimpses and we see examples and we see signs, but I don't think we see like a wave coming quite yet. That's one way to answer that question. And the other is, I think there is another one, which is about the like social kind of consensus around this. And that one is much slower, it's harder to pick up, and you can only see it kind of like in the depth of time. But I do think that the consensus and the thinking in society is slowly moving us towards making these issues more and more important. And so what you see is more and more people thinking about their food, thinking that maybe the food you eat shouldn't be terribly destructive to the environment, but maybe it should be healthy. So I think we see, and this is generational as well, more and more a sort of slowly like upward rising movement where this is in people's mind. So I think it's progress. It's probably not exactly what you wanted to hear, but I think this is progress. It's going to take a long time, but eventually it will set the expectations, the social expectations about what we should eat and how it's produced. And I think we're probably moving in the right direction on that one. Sorry, I feel like I've said a lot. Over to you.
I'm really grateful for the context setting. And I think you're absolutely right. And I'd build rather than add, if you like, or it's kind of the same thing. But I think there are two places where we see progress along those lines. And one is when we see an entire business model transformation. The likes of IKEA, for example, who have a CEO who's deeply passionate about change across the board, particularly around environmental change, but has introduced that around the food. So in their restaurants and in their retail and in their at-home customer journey, there is a genuine commitment to pivoting the business model in service of the environmental transition. I think in those cases, we see a genuine bit of progress. I think the other place we see it would be in retail, where we are seeing positive reward for consumer and client around making good choices, if you like. And to Alejandro's point, there are many and it's hard to capture them all. But if we're seeing a reward scheme in favor of good environmental and good health choices from the consumer, like there's a Dutch retailer called Ahold Delhaize who does a really good reward scheme there. I think Tesco Club Card, but you get more points for vegetables. And then there's a third area where I think we see progress in a very different way, and it's one which is very counter to the way that maybe policy and regulation approaches it, which is in primary production of food in the farms and so on. Peer-to-peer influence is really significant, and where we allow farms and farmers to develop new ways to approach their problems and find their own solutions, and then share it with their peer farmers in their neighbours' backyard, essentially. That is where we're starting to see movements of change happening in a way that isn't thrust upon them. I think that's quite positive.
So progress is slowly being made in the industries. Progress is slowly being made in consumer attitudes, not quite at the scale or the pace that we want. What does that mean for where the biggest opportunities for green jobs growth currently lies?
Should I go first? Sure. So in the new jobs, I think there are a number of new job types within food and farming and ag, and I think they are going to happen at different scales, at different speeds, and in different areas. I think initially what we're seeing at the moment is there is a huge influx in low-skilled, if you like, not unskilled, employment, job opportunities in compliance and risk. So this is businesses attempting to comply with the regulation that is coming in, both from the policy environment that they exist in, but also from their supply chain and their customers. And they are trying to tick boxes, and there are so many different boxes to tick, and there are so many different systems they have to comply with that they need to recruit people to literally tick boxes and make sure that those forms are filled in and so on. That will very rapidly be replaced with automation, I would imagine, in the next 5 years, at which point I think we'll see a growth in the CSO role, in the kind of green strategy piece. I think we'll see a lot more of those sorts of roles which set the tone for what's needed, and they will need to be at the board level if we're going to see genuine change. And we will inevitably see what's already happening, which is that they get employed as a CSO, but it's actually below board level. They get the title without the influence, and that will happen for a while, I would have thought. Then we will get closer to 2030. So this is a very short time span. And we will start to see the urgency around Scope 3. And then we will need to have a very trained and highly educated group of people who are able to actually tackle Scope 3 on the ground. And I think that will be quite a big workforce in sort of influx. And I would imagine that will happen in the next 2 years. That's where I kind of see the bigger jobs coming from.
Alejandro, where do you see them coming from?
Yeah, I guess I would first qualify what we mean by green jobs, and then all that kind of like preamble that I gave, I think is relevant here. So I would think of green jobs in the food sector as jobs that accomplish that very complicated balance of being environmentally sustainable or conducive towards environmental sustainability, to social inclusion or social justice or equity, and to health and nutrition. So again, it's a pretty like, it's like a Christmas tree of like things you want, right, from those jobs. So it's hard. So what sorts of jobs out there might kind of take us there, or might fulfill all those things? And so I think maybe there's a couple of areas. One that I think is already happening, and it's gonna only get more important, is on the issue of animal protein alternatives. The reason for that is because most of the CO2 emissions and most of the biodiversity loss in our food system is associated with producing livestock, okay? Beef mostly, but also chicken and sheep and pigs, so all of that, but beef is the main one. So jobs that kind of help us take us out of that situation are really important. It also has a very important health component, because like we don't need actually a lot of meat to be healthy. We need like a little bit of meat, but not a lot. So all these like a reliance on more plants for our diet is really important. So jobs that kind of take us there are also important. And then finally, on the social inclusion, all of this needs to be affordable, and it needs to be basically available for everybody. It doesn't count if we have like a great alternative that is like so expensive that only like rich people can have it, right? So again, ticking all these boxes, then which are the jobs that might help produce alternatives to animal protein that are plant-based and healthy, and that are also affordable? So that kind of like, if you imagine 3 circles, like in a little Venn diagram, like it's like those jobs in the middle. And so I think the creation and the development, the production from agriculture through processing, marketing, retail, logistics, everything that has to do with alternatives to animal protein, and that includes meat, and that includes meat products, and that includes dairy and dairy products. All of that has a huge potential for growth. So I think that's a really like I would, if I were an investor, I would be looking at that intersection, right? And then maybe the last thing I'd say is another part of that equation is seafood. And again, because seafood tends to have lower environmental impact, can be more socially inclusive, is very nutritious. So I think just not looking at like this problem from the point of view of land and agriculture, but also from the kind of outside of agriculture, looking to the water. We are an island, so like there's lots of water and there's lots of fish and there's lots of seafood around. So I think seafood is probably part of that equation as well.
As in, you think we'll be eating more seafood, so there'll be more jobs created in...
I think in any scenario of reducing beef consumption, we would have to eat more fish and seafood. Now, whether we will or not, I don't know, but that is kind of like, we should.
The impact of alternative proteins, I think, is very interesting to a lot of people. There was a report out earlier this year that said that particular sector itself might create something like 25,000 new jobs by 2035, I think. But obviously those are slightly different skills to what we would look at as traditional farming skills. Do those skills exist in the UK agri-food sector? Are they things that we need to train people up on?
I don't think there's like a radical new set of skills that are needed for that transformation, but I think it's more at the big sort of policy and incentives levers that are gonna like channel the jobs towards that sector. But I think fundamentally, of course, farming needs to be done slightly different, so it's not so destructive, but I think the knowledge and the skills are there that I think perhaps they need to be applied more broadly. processing, retail, logistics. I think all of those elements are kind of roughly in place. I think it's more about what kind of goes into those supply chains that needs to change. But I don't know if you have.
Add to that, I think the other gap in terms of how we build those jobs within the UK market is that we have a lot of seed funding available for those kinds of businesses. We've got lots of entrepreneurs who are finding investment for that startup phase and potentially up to Series A. What we're not seeing is businesses that are willing to then invest in those businesses to get them to scale. And I think that's because it's a question of risk. So people are very excited about the newness of it, but the scaling up is less evident. With an exception, I did some work recently with Upfield, now, as of yesterday, known as Flora. And they kind of in-housing their innovators, if you like, and scaling with them by introducing them into the product range and then having them live in their science factory or whatever. And I think that's quite an exciting model. But at the moment in the UK, I'm not seeing a huge amount of funding going into that. Like, how do they get off the ground? So I think that will be a gap here, potentially not in the rest of Europe.
Can we come back to something that you mentioned earlier around the question of where sustainability sits in an organisation? You talked before, I think, about where green sits in an organisation. If we look at those larger corporate entities, if we're talking about CSOs getting to board level and so on, what do people need to be retraining themselves in those kinds of roles, and how can they be pushing that along and pushing it up the agenda in the organisations where they work?
I love this question, Matt. I've just spent quite a long time interviewing lots of female CSOs because it appears to be one of the roles where, for want of not being too provocative, women are allowed to be in the C-suite. People roles and sustainability roles seem to be where we see more women on the board. And time and again, I ask these women, and it's for an interview series we're doing, what does it take to be in your role? What do you need to be able to do? And the key skills seem to be empathy, because essentially what you're trying to do if you're in a sustainability role is what the HR people did 15 years ago, which is you have to deliver all the sustainability for the whole business and no one else is responsible. So you have to be able to empathize with the positions other parts of the business are in order to enable them to understand why they should help you achieve your goals. The other part of it seems to be around negotiation, having pretty sharp elbows, because you have to muscle in on discussions which are essentially, these are the commercial discussions of the business. Maybe we'll have people, because quite often there's some litigation in it, so that counts to the bottom line. Sustainability, do your thing. We're all for you, we're really backing you. But there's an unwillingness to let sustainability transform the business model, typically. And I think what we need to see is the skill set you'll need will be one which is able to position yourself through empathy and through sheer determination to get into a position where you can then influence business models and see true impact.
So is it a case of proving the economic case within your organisation? It's not just this is something we have to do to meet these compliance and regulation bits, but actually this is something that will make us more profitable, and have that mindset shift?
Yeah, I mean, actually those two are more or less the same thing at the moment, because compliance and risk proves to be a very relevant financial concern for our CFO groups. So it's actually quite a useful tool for CSOs at the moment. I think more than ever, I think maybe pre-2010 we saw this, we need to see the financial ROI case for sustainability. I don't think it's always a bad thing, because it allows us to drive impact. And there's probably been a few years here and there where we've done sustainability for sustainability's sake. We haven't necessarily seen the impact. So really being able to drive impact, both on the bottom line side of things, but also on top line. There's plenty of opportunity to be grabbed around how do we build our commercial model and take an advantage by having sustainability as the thing we're selling. And that's something we're starting to see quite a lot more of. And then I would also add that the case and the ROI could also be done through non-financial metrics. So if we can start to see people pushing those kind of KPIs around biodiversity, around carbon and all of those things onto the thing the board sees every month, then we'll start to see the relevance of the role improve.
Can I just quickly say, I mean, obviously the World Benchmarking Alliance where I work is kind of created on the premise that the companies will care, and that eventually that will go all the way up, and that the company's behavior will change. But, you knew there was a but coming. I think we cannot kind of lose sight of the reality of like the bottom line and the profits for companies, and the tension between the shareholders' expectations for profit and the whatever lofty sort of ambitions a company might have. So I think that tension is very real. There's a famous case of Paul Polman, who was the CEO of Unilever, who is seen as a kind of pioneering sort of figure in the world of corporate sustainability. And a couple of years ago, basically, like shareholders said, like, we love like all your promises, and like that sounds very nice, but like we care about the money and we care about the profits. And Unilever had to kind of scale back some of the things they've done. And again, I'm not kind of like, it's not that sort of like blaming thing. I'm just saying it is a very real demand. And I think companies in the sort of agricultural supply chain, particularly where like smallholder farmers are involved. We did a piece of work a couple of years ago where we're just talking to the companies. They have had to kind of scale back, actually, with COVID, with the war in Ukraine. Like the pressures on the companies are huge, and so they even what they promise, they're scaling back what they promise. So I do just want to say that it is a real kind of material tension in a company, and so the more it translates into, or the more alignment between the company's bottom line and some of these indicators, then I think that's where we'll see more progress.
There's been a trend over recent years as we become more aware of food security, to shortening supply chains, to onshoring again some agricultural roles. There was a report recently that said 65% of food and drink companies have focused on this over the last year or so. I wonder if, obviously that can mean more jobs here, hopefully green jobs. I wonder if you see that as a long-term trend, or is that just a temporary fix?
I think on farming and ag, it has the potential to be a long-term trend, and it's certainly something that the policy space is looking into. I think what we see in farmers at the moment is that there is a complete disaggregation between the desire to have more new farming and ag jobs in the younger farmer contingent and also outside of that, and the ways that they are able to make money. So we haven't yet done a decent subsidy replacement scheme. We haven't yet figured out a way to remove subsidies for the incumbent food system and offer the opportunity to have a green job within farming, which is subsidized to the point where people can actually make money. And the margins are so tight in farming that there is a real disincentivization to join the family business or even start up your own farm. I think if we are able to get the subsidy market right, and if we are able to start thinking about marketing farming jobs as something that's interesting and exciting, and there is evidence to that effect, then perhaps we can see a long-term trend in that direction. I think if it pays better to turn your farm into a campsite, then farmers will do that. They're incredibly canny and commercial folks.
I think that's exactly right. I would just, for context, only about 1% of the UK population works in farming. So that's about 500,000 people. So the kind of general trend in like rich industrialized societies is that that percentage doesn't move that much. So I don't think it's realistic to expect that we're going to get, you know, a huge amount of like new farmers. I think what we can get with the right incentives is for farmers to like turn to other sorts of business models, and with a more perhaps entrepreneurial or different approach to start hitting some of these targets and to think with an environmentally like sustainable hat and to think of health and nutrition. So I think there's ways to move that small percentage into like a different direction, and perhaps the onshoring will mean that there's a slight increase. But just to say that there's also opportunities not just in farming but across the supply chain. So I don't think we should just limit ourselves to thinking of that 1%, but think of all the opportunities and the possible jobs that can be associated with processing, with retailing, with logistics, with transport. So there is, I think, potential for growth there in addition to farming.
So that was one of the things, that 5% figure that I quoted at the top. Most of that growth came in wholesaling, retailing, catering. The one area that was going the other way was more the manufacturing and that small proportion of farmers. Ellie, you mentioned farming in particular. The food sector in general is run on thin margins. If we don't want our food suppliers going bust, and we want them to provide food for us, in a sustainable way, how do we keep them profitable?
Great question. I think back to my subsidies point, that's got to shift. I think there's another piece which is around pre-competitive collaboration in favour of the direction of travel we want our food systems to go. And there are limitations there, particularly in Europe, but less so here, which says, okay, who are our big buyers of food and farming, and how can they get together to support farmers to shift their business models towards biodiversity, positive environments, towards soil health, towards all of those great things. I think there's another piece which is probably more about how we reskill. And in the young farmers I come across, which is getting fewer and fewer, sadly, but the thing that really differentiates them when they are coming back into the family business, and it typically is skipping a generation, and we're talking about the third gen, is that they are very well educated in the data. And in order to maintain or grow margins, they are thinking really carefully about what numbers they need to put in order to get their crop out. And that means looking at fertilizer. And often, if we think about reducing fertilizer, if we think about no-till farming, we also cut our costs and then see our yield increase and our land be in better quality. So there's some really interesting work going on. It's just a question of how we share that and how we educate farmers within the higher education system as well, I think.
Can I just come in to add, and I fully agree with you, but I think there is something about there is a fundamental problem around the value of food, okay? And so there is this expectation that food needs to be cheap, and the reason the margins are so low is because farmers are under great pressure to produce cheaply, and so the value of what they produce is actually quite low. So there needs to be like a total kind of like social reconfiguration around the value of food, and there is some efforts along this line on what they call the true cost accounting, where you're like, okay, the steak that you buy, it's really cheap, but actually you start factoring in how much actually it costs, all the what are called externalities, like how much it costs society to like get rid of the greenhouse gases, to get rid of the antibiotics and all this stuff, then actually that steak actually is quite expensive, but the farmer only gets a little bit. So I think there is like a whole kind of reconfiguration that needs to happen. But also, and you mentioned them, incentives, subsidies. Right now the incentives and the subsidies are pushing farmers towards all this kind of race to the bottom to produce cheaply, great quantities, like as much as you can. And I think if we repurpose subsidies to support consumers instead, to some extent, so that they are able to buy food that is slightly closer to what it actually costs, involving the externalities, that sort of rebalancing, I think, is really important.
Can I just say one thing on that? Because I think you're absolutely right, and something that keeps coming up is this issue of, I need to be really diplomatic about how I say this. There is a very loud, probably majority, saying that we are in a nanny state, particularly of late, which is trying to control what we do, and the idea of shifting subsidies towards a different food system is met with the kind of pushback that doesn't appear to appreciate how subsidized the status quo is. I think there's a gap in knowledge around how much money goes into continuing the status quo.
That's a great point. In fact, there is a nanny state. It's just like the nanny state is protecting like people that like other people, right? Yeah.
So how would a consumer subsidy system work then? That's different to what we currently have, where government gives money to support the food system.
I mean, there's lots of ways in which this can be done, and obviously I'm not a subsidy expert, so I'm not gonna like tell you exact. But the point is, if you raise the price of food at the production end, then obviously you make it less affordable particularly for people in low incomes, right? So you need to ensure that so this as a probably targeted subsidies, right, where people in low incomes are able to have extra money so that the price that they can afford the price of that slightly more expensive food. But there's also ways in which that can happen. So one example in the United States is food stamps, where like low-income people are giving food stamps when they can't afford food. The problem is that these food stamps, often what they can be bought or what they can be spent on is actually junk food, right? So there needs to be a sort of conditionality associated with how this is spent. And again, I'm not like an expert on the design of these things, but just I think there is, like I said, a bit of a social kind of expectation or social discourse shift against from just asking farmers to like crank out as much as they can to helping consumers make better choices and actually being able to afford better and healthier and more sustainable food.
So we're talking very much about the UK, but you both have a very global outlook in your roles. I wonder which other countries do you think are doing this well? Which other countries are managing the transformation of their food systems in a green, sustainable, healthy, environmentally helpful ways that the UK could perhaps be looking to?
I wish I had the answer. I love the idea that the Netherlands is better than we are, which isn't winning, but there's certainly a tendency towards supporting equality of access to good food, whatever that looks like. And then I think there are also pockets of seasonality in terms of purchasing and supply, which happen in some countries where there's less of an import culture. But I don't think anyone's winning, I would say, on that. So we're far behind in a race with a very low bar.
I mean, and with all due respect to Dutch people in the audience, like this is the first time I heard good food and Netherlands in the same sentence. But yes, the Netherlands is recognized as a sort of leader in trying to move the sort of levers of the state towards healthier, more sustainable food, with a huge caveat, which is that has resulted in a huge backlash from farmers. And so the recent election of a right-wing Dutch government is really like totally like predicated on a big farmer protest movement, basically around like the Netherlands government clamping down on the use of fertilizers. And so there's like this, anyway, just to say, beware what kind of you wish for, because you have no idea where that might land you. But I would agree no country currently is doing enough. But again, just not to end on like a terribly like negative note, there are really interesting examples. Mexico, Chile, Colombia, they are introducing a whole set of incentives and taxes to make ultra-processed food more expensive and to like try to shift consumer behavior there. Countries across Europe, of course, are doing subsidy reform, so to incentivize more like environmental protection of agriculture. So there is progress, but I don't think one country has figured everything out.
I think the point about the farmer protests is really critical, and we're seeing it across Europe over this summer. And it sort of points to that importance of engaging with the people that we are putting upon to make change happen. And that happens both in the farmer world, but also in the customer space, right? We backlash like crazy when people try to change our habits if we're not brought on the journey properly. And that engagement piece is often lacking, and it's often the reason things fall down.
So there was a report issued recently by LSE and Oxford University that suggested that transforming food systems could release value of $10 trillion per year globally. If you factor in improvements in climate and human health, nutrition, natural resources, and so on. So, Alejandro, you said a moment ago, be careful what you wish for, but I'm now going to give you both free rein to wish for whatever you want. If you were given free rein to change the food systems here with a focus on jobs and sustainable eating and green jobs, what would you do?
I've got a thought, but I'll probably get home and regret what I've said and have a much better idea, Matt, and have to email you. There's a very, very good charity in Hackney called Chefs in Schools, and they run something called Hackney School of Food as well. And they do two things. They recruit and train excellent chefs to go into schools across the country. And they also have education programs for local low-income families to learn how to cook with the food that they get from food banks. Those two things at scale, sponsored by government, I think would be an incredibly critical route to jobs and to transforming our food system in a way that would enable change to happen at scale.
Great. Alejandro?
I'm gonna go for a couple of different things. So one is at the policy. One is like a policy sort of like Christmas wish list, which is around incentives and subsidies. And I think actually to be like more positive, I think this country is quite fortunate that there is a broad political consensus around the issue of healthy and sustainable food. So we're not like fighting whether, like debating whether cows do produce methane or not. Like I think we're good in that sense. And so I think there is kind of political will and a broad kind of electoral support for this. And it's so difficult to reform subsidies, but I think the incentives definitely need to go away from, currently subsidies are still livestock, meat, crank out as much as you can. I think subsidies definitely to incentivize different things. We're moving there, and I think the UK has done some progress there, but I think that needs to be, so I think subsidy reform is a really, really important one. And I think just generally, education, shifting the cultural sort of norm around what is desirable. I was chatting with Ellie earlier, like slavery at some point became untenable. So like we need to make the consumption of like terribly unsustainable food also something like a slavery or like something like that, where it's like the society does not accept it anymore. So I think again, we're making progress there, but I think we need to continue that.
Great. We've got a few minutes left before we finish talking about food and eating some. I wonder if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask. I see a hand up here.
Hi there. I'm Ben Cott. Nice to meet you. Thanks both for the context. I have just a couple of comments and maybe some notes again about green jobs as well. So Alejandro, thanks for the great preamble. I really liked it. And ELEANOR as well, you were tying everything back to the world and global warming and climate change. However, I felt the need to speak up because I think there was a couple of pieces of information that were misleading at best, wrong at worst. We don't need any meat at all to live and to survive as humans. And I think the big, or fish, I think the big elephant in the room is animal-based production and animal consumption. I've been fighting against climate change for a couple of decades. I've met Basil 10 years ago doing green buildings, and we're totally screwed, and we all know this, and I know this room knows it. But the big elephant in the room is we need to switch our food system to an entirely plant-based food system. 60% of our production now in the agricultural production is to feed animals, which we then consume in a very inefficient way. And by the way, there's no good meat or good fish. No living being wants to die for human consumption. So you said people need a little bit of meat, people need zero meat. We can live entirely plant-based. I'm living proof of that. My children are living proof of that. Millions of people are. And I think you suggested, but correct me if I got this wrong, that we should eat more fish. If that was true, then that's the worst thing I've heard in a long time, because fish stocks are depleted, oceans are warming up, oceans are collapsing. Fish farming is the worst thing I've seen myself. I went to Norway, I've seen it myself, pesticides, all that stuff. We don't eat fish either. So I wanted to just correct this or just speak up for that. By the way, this comes from a guy, as you can tell, I didn't grow up in this country. I grew up in Bavaria. For the first 20 years of my life, if I didn't have meat twice a day, I thought I was going to die the next day, right? And I've turned completely plant-based a few years ago, and it's fine. I'll tie it back, so I didn't mean to offend you, but I know you're able to take it because you were picking up on a couple of things. I'll tie it back to green jobs, actually. I addressed the elephant in the room in climate change. I think there's an amazing number and amount of opportunities in green jobs in plant-based nutrition and plant-based health, on the health consultancies, new types of food, new types of products, new types of recipes, and communication and marketing of the stuff. So I think there's an amazing opportunity in the next few years coming from that as well. Thanks a lot. Just wanted to bring this up.
Who would like to respond?
I don't know that, I mean, thank you, Ben. And I know people have very, very strong thoughts on this. I'm more of a bit of an agnostic, actually. So I can tell you that it is true that perhaps in this society, like, we could get away with not eating meat. There's like parts of the world that have still huge, food and nutrition insecurity. On a sort of, there is nothing more nutritious on a micronutrient per calorie than beef. So if you have societies that have severe undernutrition, say in sub-Saharan Africa, some parts of India, then you absolutely, in my mind, need meat as part of your toolkit. Like if you don't, it's suicide, it's crazy, it's unfair to people. So I think that your point, which I take it and respect, is context specific. And so when I say we need little meat, I practically don't eat any meat, but I can't go to like rural, like Uganda, and tell people not to eat meat because I would be doing a disservice. So what I'm saying is, I respect your point. I think it's a great point. I do think we need to eat less. Whether it's like an absolute thing or not, I think is context specific. But thank you for your point.
I'd also add, thanks, Ben. I've spent a lot of time in behaviour change, and particularly us Brits hate to be told what to do, particularly our boomer generation. And I think the narrative around reducing and cutting back and getting to a point where there is a lot less meat in the diet is far more palatable to that group of people, and saying zero tolerance often pushes them to go the other way, typically. Now, I don't disagree with you that we need to be moving a long way away from the meat consumption levels we're at, but I quite like, in the UK context, Henry Dimbleby's food strategy. If you haven't read it, I think it's called the National Food Strategy, which is very good because it looks at land use management and calories per acre, or whatever number he uses. And it's a very good way to look at how we scale back meat consumption and enable our farming communities and our food system to benefit from economic growth, which I think is really powerful.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions in the room?
Thank you so much. I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about the growing regenerative agriculture movement and the impact that's having on the food systems. Just for a little bit of context, in the last 5 years, the Groundswell Agriculture Festival has grown from, and I quote the taxi cab driver, a bunch of few hippies in the field, to over 8,000 people coming to my local village in a very few years. And this is very much a by farmers for farmers movement. And I just wonder if you can touch on that impact, because it's not only happening in the UK, but I haven't heard much mention of it.
I went to Groundswell this year for the second time, and I was absolutely blown away by the difference there is when you go to Groundswell versus going to other conferences about food. Obviously this one, notwithstanding. And the difference was that it was farmers leading the narrative, and it was farmers being in a position and in a place and a space where they felt they were able to speak, saying their truth, and they were able to say it to an audience of people who typically don't get challenged. So you had Unilever there, and they were on a panel hosted by farmers, with farmers challenging them with very difficult questions, and I thought that was really powerful. And the question about regenerative ag, I think, is a really important one, because it's something we talk about a lot in our communities. We all know it, we all know the buzzwords, we know kind of broadly what it means. We don't define it very well, and we certainly don't see our consumers demanding it. And I think the problem that we have around regen ag is twofold. One, we're not willing to invest in it from a retailer and a manufacturer perspective. We're not willing to absorb the cost of what it will take to transform, and we're not willing to pay our farmers enough for them to do it either. And our consumers, although they say they have a preference for it, will then not pay any premium for that kind of food. So I think, again, we go back to Alejandro's, if you could do one thing, if we could subsidize and standardize the backing of a regenerative ag system in the UK, then we have an opportunity to bring better food and better farming to everybody in the country. I think it's really important. Well, that brings us to the end of this session. I would like to thank Ellie and Alejandro. If we could have a round of applause for them for the insights that they've shared with us.